What is up, guys? Today we're gonna go over a single rule from Bobby Fischer that allows you to defeat intermediate or even advanced level players. In this position it was white to play, the white player Bazan is playing against Fischer who's playing black, and white played a really creative move bishop to c7. Now that aims to deflect the queen with this sacrifice, and after this white grabbed this pawn on d5, and here's the position that I wish to discuss. And it's not about this position really, because the same logic of thinking will apply to literally every game that you play. Now, how would you play here if you are black? Just think about this for a couple seconds and then we'll discuss it together. Now at this point you may see that there is this pawn, which double attacks these two minor pieces, but the problem for black is that they can't take it with the bishop because the bishop is actually pinned down to the king. Therefore, the exposed king is yet another problem besides these two hanging pieces. Now, how would you play here? Now, let me show you initially how I think most players would handle this position, and then we'll come back and see how Fischer did the same thing. So most players would realize that their king is in trouble, this bishop is attacked, the knight is attacked, the king is vulnerable, and they wish to move the king away. Therefore, you can castle either a kingside or queenside. And castling kingside doesn't look too good because the king is still wide open right here, thanks to this pawn being on g5, therefore it doesn't look good. Maybe castling queenside looks better. After that, white will probably take here on e6. Now let's say black recaptures, and for example white takes this pawn on c4. Now black realizes that this pawn is also annoying. We've got our king and queen standing on the same file, so maybe we want to move the king away. Now of course I don't know how you play here, but I'm just telling you how most players would do this, and you may let me know in comments below if that is accurate or not. So after king b8, let's say our pawn goes knight e5, he's still creating more and more threats against its knight on c6. And let's say we see that knight takes c6 is coming. We can't move the knight because it's pinned down to the queen. If they are capable of taking right here, they're going to split up your pawns, open up your king again, so maybe you're going to go rook to d6, and we're still trying to hold on to our defense. But here's the problem really. After this, let's say white takes here on c6, you recapture, we trade everything, and white goes queen e5, and that is actually a game over. Now, here's the moral of the story. Passive defense in chess is something that initially we learn as beginners, but this actually is counterproductive as you become a little bit more advanced. Now, the main problem with the passive defense is that it allows your opponent to just keep attacking. Just think about this. That is exactly what happened right here after white played pawn d5 at the beginning of the example. We always tried to be reactive and to somehow defend against his threats, and white was just keep attacking with every new move that he plays, and ultimately he got us. Now, what did Fischer do in this position? Now, he followed another rule, which is offense is the best defense. And that turns the situation around pretty quick. When you just ask yourself a different question, instead of asking, how do I defend, you ask yourself, is there any attacking move that I can play here? And the beauty of that question, what I love about this, is that in many positions there is just one or maybe two maximum theoretically possible attacking moves, such as in this position. How can black really attack if you think about this? Like, we can't take this pawn because it's guarded by the knight. That would be a blunder. And normally when you wish to attack, you need to focus your attention on opponent's half of the board and ask yourself how can you advance there and attack something or capture something. The other move is pawn g4, and that is what Fischer played. Now that just counters this knight on f3. And in the game, white just moved the knight back. Now what would happen if white were to take one of these pieces? Well, guess what? Black would counter this knight and also attack the queen. If white were to capture right here, there is also a useful technique when you shelter your king with your opponent's pawn, and after that you end up with this extra knight. The position remains to be complex, but nevertheless we're up a knight, life's good, we're gonna grab this pawn later with our queen. In the game, white decided to move this knight away, he played knight to d2, and now you may practice the same idea once again yourself. It is black to play. How would you play here if you were black? Exactly, this time the knight no longer guards this pawn on d4, and we can just go ahead and grab it, which helps us to move our own knight from the attack. But in addition to that, we're also counterattacking his queen, meaning white has no time to grab our bishop, they have to move the queen away. Now white wanted to, of course, maintain this pin along the e-file, therefore they played queen to e4, probably still thinking that black's in trouble. Now this knight is hanging, the bishop is hanging, some rook takes c4 stuff is coming, so what would you play here? and the idea is still the same. Even though the move is quite complex, but nevertheless the idea is the same. You ask yourself, how do I move in my opponent's half of the board and attack something? And with that in mind, Fischer played Queen f4, which is a brilliant move. Indeed, it counters the queen, this knight on d2, and the idea here is that if the queen is taken, Black would respond with knight to e2 with this royal fork, and he would grab his queen back. And that is actually pretty good for Black, because after the king moves, we take right here. Now, after queens come off the board, we no longer worry about our king in the middle of the board, and we enjoy our extra material. Right now, we're up a bishop, but even if he takes it, we can recapture here, or maybe solidify this pawn on b5. And as a result of this whole thing, we are up pawn in an endgame, these passers are going to go forward, and we probably are going to win the game. At the same time, we gotta give credit to the white player as well. He played a bunch of really great moves here. He played rook takes c4, adding more fuel to the fire of his attack. And now after we trade here on e2, it turns out that it's still not that easy for Black, because now this knight on d4 is hanging, the bishop is hanging, and taking on d5 is not that good, because White could either just take the knight or play knight f6 with this fork and then take something. Therefore, White is still in the game. It was still not easy. Now at this point, you may also think about which move would you play here, and this time it's simpler than it was before, because we can remove one of these pieces under the attack by playing knight e2. Now king goes here, and now Fischer played the move which was interesting, but interestingly enough, Stockfish says that there was an even more brutal move for Black to play. Now, the issue is still the same. The bishop is attacked, and if we just take right here, that still fails to this knight f6 fork to the king and bishop. Plus, this knight on e2 is also a little bit vulnerable. Maybe White wants to attack it. So the best move for Black was the move that Fischer missed, pawn to f5. Absolutely brutal. We just keep counterattacking no matter what. And now also our knight actually takes away some squares for this knight to move away to. And if it goes somewhere here, then after king e7 we counter the knight again. And if we imagine something like this, we're still up a knight in an endgame. And even if White tries to capture it somehow, we'll at least be up a pawn and we're probably winning. In the actual game, Fischer found another idea, which is a little bit weaker, objectively speaking, but is still an unbelievable idea. By the way, here we see the really highest level of execution of the counterattack. And after this game, I'll show you exactly what you can do in your own games, just talking about more casual situations, more down-to-earth examples, and how you can apply this idea to really break through to the next level. Because what I've witnessed is that quite often people bypass the level of a beginner in chess relatively easily, because your opponents make a lot of mistakes. You can make use of them and win. But as you get to the intermediate level or even advanced level, your opponents stop making all those blunders, and then it's much harder to win. And quite often people find themselves in a situation when they hit the plateau and they just can't progress any further. Their results goes a little bit up and down around that plateau, but they never progress, sometimes never in their life. And this is one of those ideas that can help you to break through and really get to the next level. All right, so here Fischer played bishop d7, and at first looks like, okay, we got the job done. We're in an endgame. Our king is no longer in danger. I mean, White can deliver a check, but usually in an endgame, they cannot checkmate you, and we're up a piece. But White played rook e1, and it turned out that, hey, Black is still in trouble. First of all, there aren't that many squares for this knight to go to, but even if the knight moves, you know, let's say somewhere here, the issue with this rook is that it sets it up for all kinds of discovered checks. For instance, something like knight to d6 check, and then White can win this knight on f4, and in this case, White will probably even win the game. So knight e4 does not work for Black. And at this point, Fischer played king to f8, setting up another nice trap. Now, if the rook takes this knight, we're ready to play bishop b5, skewing this two rooks, and thus winning some material anyway. But the battle didn't stop here. White player was also highly creative. He played knight f6, which maybe even kept Fischer by surprise. I think this is a little bit of an unusual idea. So here's the deal. We're attacking this bishop and this knight on e2. Now, how would you react here as Black? Offense is the best defense, right? We aim to counterattack. So he played bishop b5. Initially, it looks good. White goes rook b4. He's also counterattacking. Bishop a6. Looks like Black is in control now. He's covering everything. Life's good. But White goes knight d7 check. And that is quite an unusual way for White to stay in the game. Now, normally, Black would not want to go back to the e-file under this rook. However, in this case, he has to, because he can't go king g7. Strangely enough, that leads to this unusual checkmate in the endgame. Quite a sudden idea. Fischer didn't fall for this trap, of course, but he had to move the king back to the e-file, where the knight is pinned, and after knight c5, Black is facing yet another issue. Now white wants to grab this knight, this bishop, and then this knight on e2. So what do? Fischer played rook e8. I'm not asking you to find this move because the idea behind it is quite difficult one. Anyway, rook e8. The idea was after knight to a6, Fischer actually prepared one more counter blow. This time it's king to d6. And now we've got the dual threat of pawn takes a6. However, if white deals with that threat, which he did by rook takes b7, there is one more threat which black prepared here, which is knight to g3. This is a check and a discovered attack of this rook. Pretty brutal. Now I captured, now rook takes e1, the king is in check, it has to move, and now black is up material, they won the exchange. However, it still remains to be a little bit complex because, white is attacking this pawn on f7, these pawns are also weak, white will still try to pick up all these weaknesses, the pawn on a7 is under the attack. And by the way, let this be your practice. So please let me know in comments below how would you play here if you were black. It is black to play, and of course you want to win the game. Back in the day, I went to a boxing club, and a coach there told me something that actually relates to chess exactly, and it also resonates with what we're talking about. There, the coach told me that you don't want to settle for a passive defense, known as high guard defense, because the issue is your opponent will keep attacking you, and it is just a matter of time when he will eventually get to you. So the way to end your opponent's attack is to counterattack, and that is why offense is the best defense. Now, here's how it works in chess. I'm going to show you some simpler example, not the one that we talked about before with Fischer demonstrating some really high-level counterattacking skills. Let's say white goes for this color's mate attempt. Does it mean that you want to always counterattack? Well, generally speaking, yes, but it's not always possible. Like in this position, yes, you do need to somehow stop this queen takes f7 threat. So sometimes you do need to defend only if there is nothing better. Here you still need to cover up this thing. Let's say white goes queen b3. But the idea is that you always ask yourself that question, is there any counterattacking move? And if there is such a move, usually it's the best move to play. And only if there's no counterattack available at all, only then you just settle for defense. Now, think about this position for a second. What is the right move for black to play? By the way, less than 20% of players actually found it, and it is basically a winning move. Now, most players realize that there is a battery against this f7 pawn, so they played queen e7, trying to defend it. But that's the issue with defense. That does not win the game, and that does not even stop the attack really, because your opponent will keep bringing more pieces into his attack. Now, so the right move is asking yourself, how do I counterattack? How do I move forward onto my opponent's half of the board and attack something? And the right move is knight to d4, where it hits the queen and also puts pressure to this pawn on c2. Now I can still deliver this check on f7, but then we just move the king away, and it turns out that not only the queen is hanging, this bishop on f7 is also vulnerable, plus white still needs to guard this pawn on c2. Now white has no time to think about his attack, he's got to actually defend, and that is how offense is the best defense. So if white wants to save this bishop on f7, they need to go queen to c4, and what do you do then? Again, lots of players in this position played something like pawn d6, trying to play bishop b6 and trying to guard the exposed king, but we know that the right strategy is asking yourself, how do I attack? So the right move is pawn b5, hitting the queen once again. And now the queen can no longer maintain the defense of this bishop. All the squares along this diagonal are taken. Therefore, the queen has to move off this diagonal, but as he does so, we can happily grab the bishop. Moreover, in this case, unintentionally, we did this with this counter-attacking threat to the queen. And the queen still has to move. If they want to grab this pawn right here on e5, what do you do then? Well, it's not really even a counter-attacking move. I mean, it is technically, but it's fairly easy to notice that knight takes c2 in this case also wins the rook, and within just a couple moves, you erased half of his pieces and you got to a totally winning position. Let me emphasize this idea one more time. In this position, more than 80% of players could not find the right counterattacking move, knight to d4, even though it's a relatively easy example of a counterattack, which means that you've got a great opportunity. We have to deal with our opponents attacking us in every game that you play, and most of your opponents have no idea about a counterattack. Therefore, if you master that, that easily puts you ahead of the crowd. And I think this also addresses one of the common fallacies about chess, that in order to get good at chess, you gotta have that natural mysterious talent, plus you have to study like absolutely everything in chess, and it's super complicated. While in reality, sometimes just one idea is enough to make you a lot stronger chess player. For example, if you just learn to not blunder pieces, that's already plus 300 rating points in no time, just that one thing alone. If you learn these counter-attacking ideas, that's plus 200 rating points on top of that. So you can see that chess progress can be much smoother if you know those most important ideas to focus on. So if you're really curious about that, I've got a dedicated course called 3 Steps to 2000 ELO. I'll drop a link down below this video. You can check it out and get it if you like. Now let's train the skill of a counterattack. So here we go into the Pierce defense. Guys told me last time that it's not a perk defense, that it's a Slovenian last name that should be pronounced Pierce. So let's do it that way. Now let's say white goes for this kingside castling, aiming for bishop h6. And we've got a pretty common position, opposite side castlings. White wants to attack on the kingside. They want to trade off this dark squared bishop and then play h4, h5, open up the file and checkmate you there. What do you do then? Again, for a lot of players, it's really hard to deal with those quick and aggressive attacks against you. But what do? You follow the rule of fence is the best defense. So you ask yourself, how can I go forward to my opponent's half of the board and attack something there? And with that in mind, the move becomes pretty clear. b4, that's the only attacking move that you can possibly play, and that is also the best move. And once again, that's the beauty of counter-attacking moves. Quite often you have very few of them possible, so it's easy to pick one. Now, b4 attacks the knight. What is the problem for white? Well, if the knight moves somewhere, the issue is that now you can actually grab this knight on e4 and counterattack once again. Now we grab the pawn, we attack their queen, and the queen also still has to guard this bishop on h6, and we also attack this pawn on f2, and you can see that white's in trouble. While instead, if white tries to just say, okay, I don't care, I'm going to execute my plan, bishop takes g7, what do you do then? Again, most players would probably take this bishop. But I hope that you now understand that counterattacking is usually a better idea. So you ask yourself, can I attack on the opponent's half of the board? The answer is yes. You grab the knight, you hit the queen and the pawn. Now white also needs to worry about this bishop on g7, because if they left it there, you're going to grab it on the next move and you'll be up a piece. So the way to defend it would be to play queen h6. What do you do then? You can toss in one more counterattacking move in between, grabbing a pawn, exposing his king. He could take or possibly go king b1 just to keep it covered. And what do you do then? Once again, you can clearly see the difference. Most players would notice that the rook is hanging, would play rook e8, and that would allow white to continue his attack. What do you do instead? You ask yourself, how do I counterattack? How do I go forward? White's half of the board. And I know it's boring because I repeat the same idea over and over again, but it works. So if you go knight g4, you counter the queen. Now the queen has to move. If not, you just take it. And if the queen moves somewhere, it doesn't really matter. Then this bishop is hanging, you grab it. You also attack this pawn on f2. You're up a piece and white is completely destroyed. So that's how you solve the problem of a defense by never defending. You can even defeat grandmasters by following exactly the technique we're talking about. This is my game. I was playing black against Tikhanov, who's playing white, and he was a grandmaster. It is white to move. Now, talking about this position, black is up a pawn to right now. However, white can trade on b6. These pawns will be doubled, so that's not going to be a big deal. And objectively, that should be an equal position. However, white realized that is still not very comfortable. Black has some threats here and there, and he decided to make it even more comfortable. So instead of trading immediately, he played rook b1, attacking this knight on b2. Now, here's the position that you need to think about. You may even pause the video and think about this yourself to see if you can bring down a grandmaster. Now, black probably counted for rook takes c3. That's the most natural move for black to play, just trying to trade off everything. And it looks like white is putting pressure here, even this pawn on d5 is somewhat hanging, therefore it may feel natural for black to try to eliminate some material, trade off, but now after this trade, the pawns are doubled, white can grab this knight on b2, and the position becomes very simple. This time, even white is putting some pressure to these weak pawns along the b-file, maybe to this bishop on e7 with some sort of discovered attacks here or there, and even black needs to be careful in this position, even though it should be equal, of course. Anyway, so that's what white was hoping for. Now let's come back, and the right move for black is asking yourself, how do I move forward to my opponent's half of the board and attack something? And with that in mind, I played bishop b4. So instead of just defending or trading off, I'm seeking to counterattack. And now it turns out that it's actually quite unpleasant for white. This knight is attacked, but the knight cannot move away because he's got to guard the queen. Of course, he can trade queens first, but after that, the issue for him is if he now grabs this knight on b2, that would lose to bishop takes c3 with this double attack, and black would win material. In the game, instead of this, white just played bishop to d2. At this point, black can take on c3, but if I take right here, white is going to recapture this knight and he's fine. And what helps black to win the game is one more counterattack, knight to d3. This time we're hitting this rook as well as the bishop, and white has to lose some material. Even though white was creative, he actually played rook d1, and after rook takes c3, initially it looks like black is up a knight, but after bishop to f1, it turns out that the knight has no square to retreat. Somehow all these squares are under the control of white, and there is not a single square for the knight to go to. But anyway, after knight to c5, I managed to undouble the pawns, and at the end of the day, black is 2 pawns up, this pawn f3 is hanging, and black got a winning endgame. You can find all the complete games and all the resources I have mentioned in the description below the video. Also the course 3 Steps to 2000 ELO, which I mentioned earlier, which contains all the most important ideas to progress in chess, will be there in the description just as well. And finally, if you want to know how I went from 1600 rating to 2260 in one short year, check out the video right there.